After this point, Socrates goes on to a more specific accusation from his fellow Athenian, Meletus, who has brought a specific indictment against him. And he describes Meletus in the following way. Socrates says, Meletus has claimed that I am corrupting the youth of Athens, and I don't believe in the gods of our city, but rather I believe in some other gods. So I'm going to call Meletus onto the witness stand, as it were, and I'm going to ask him some questions in front of all of you so that we can understand what he means by that. So Socrates now engages in what we would now call a classic example of Socratic method. And this idea of Socratic method is going to be important for us throughout the course for the following reason. One thing about Socratic method that's distinctive is that it's a form of teaching that, ideally at least, in the best case, does not involve telling the student anything at all. That is to say, Socratic method does not involve my giving you any information at all. Rather, Socratic method is my trying to help you gain knowledge by virtue of drawing out from inside of you things you have some grasp of already. That is to say, by Socratic method, I enable you to come to an understanding of something on the basis of information that you already have, drawing out from inside of you what nowadays you might call something like information that you have on the unconscious level, although Socrates didn't have that concept so far as we know. So, Socrates is going to engage with Meletus in this Socratic method way. He's going to ask him a number of questions without teaching him or telling him anything, and we'll see that as a good example of one form of the cultivation of wisdom. So, Socrates calls Meletus to the witness stand and says, Meletus, who improves the youth of Athens? Who is engaged in improving the youth of Athens? And Meletus answers, in effect, everybody but you. Socrates then asks him, do wicked people harm others, and do good people benefit others? And Meletus says, yes, sure, of course. Well, Socrates goes on, would anybody will to be harmed? Would anybody consciously choose to have harm befall them? And Meletus answers, no, of course not. And Socrates says, well, okay, next question. Do I corrupt the youth deliberately? That is, on purpose? Do I do it on purpose or by accident? Meletus says, definitely you do it deliberately, on purpose. Socrates continues, but then wait a minute. If I corrupt the youth, don't I risk harming myself? That is, I'm going to be harmed by the people around me because I am making them worse if I'm corrupting them. And so it's going to be a way of harming myself by harming the people around me by corrupting them, yes? Now, Meletus does not give any answer that we can discern from the text to that question. But what Socrates has done by now is show that there's a kind of absurdity in Meletus' accusation, because it's somewhat absurd for Meletus to suggest that Socrates is harming those people around him, corrupting them, and then thereby risking harming himself in the process, because Socrates takes it and Meletus agrees that no one would willingly harm their own selves. They would only willingly harm others at most. Socrates goes on to point out that insofar as somebody might make an accusation against him, that accusation is going to be something that he's not very afraid of. In particular, he's going to say, look, I have lived here in Athens for just about all of his 70 years, except for occasional stints of military service, and I've never chosen to leave. I've lived a life that, even if it's been in poverty, even if I've irritated people, I've nevertheless found a certain amount of satisfaction in constantly questioning others, trying to learn, trying to understand, trying to achieve a kind of wisdom. And as a result, if I were to, at this point, because there's a danger of my getting the death penalty as a result of this trial, if I were at this point to be afraid of that penalty, I would take myself to have some wisdom about what things will happen to me after my body is destroyed. That wisdom would be unjustified. I don't claim to know what will happen to me after I die. Maybe I'll go to a better place, Socrates says. So my point is, Socrates says, that I'm not afraid of any sentence that you might give me. I'm going to just stand by my guns and stick to the idea that I'm going to follow my principles rather than compromise on things that I think are important. And in particular, now would be the time at which most people who are on trial would beg for mercy, would ask the jury to spare them and perhaps also their family, or spare them for the well-being of their family, and say, look, you've got to help me out here, give me some mercy, I'll do anything, I'll stop, for example, I'll stop talking philosophy, engaging in questioning with my fellow Athenians so long as you spare me my life. But Socrates says, that's what some people would do, but I'm not willing to do that myself. And the reason is that I don't think that I'd be living a life that would be of any value to me if I were to hang around in Athens but not be able to talk to people, just sit in a shop and make bowls or something. Socrates says that would be entirely unsatisfactory to me, simply because I would not be able to engage in the thing that I must love most, namely an attempt to acquire at least some kind of wisdom. Socrates says, "Men of Athens, I'm grateful and I'm your friend, but I will obey the god rather than you. And as long as I draw breath and am able to exhort you in my usual way." So Socrates says, I'm not willing to, in order to spare my life, shut up and spend the rest of my time here in Athens just being quiet, just in order to stay alive. Socrates says, my life would not be of any value to me if I were to do that. I'm not willing to compromise. Rather, he says, I was attached to the city by, he calls it, the god. That is, some deity. Remember, ancient Athenians were polytheists, and so they didn't believe in one single god. They believed in many gods, like Zeus, for example, was one among many. And he says, I was attached to the city by the god, like a gadfly to a noble steed. Athens is a noble steed, and I'm like a gadfly. My job is to spur you on to greater action, to greater speed, and to becoming a more noble city than you currently are. And Socrates continues from there. After having been given the final sentence, there's lots of discussion, the number of points that come up that we don't need to go into in great detail for our purposes, but after lots of deliberation, finally Socrates is given the penalty of death, and he chooses not to try to beg for mercy. Normally, Athenians who have been given a penalty would throw themselves at the mercy of the court. Socrates will do no such thing. And he continues and says, I think that the unexamined life is not, in fact, worth living. That is to say, if I were to stop examining myself and others, it'd be as if I was dead, but just still moving around. So I'm not willing to do that. And so he continues from there to say, as a remark, the unexamined life is not worth living.